really important preface this way because we've had some very phenomenal speakers as part of the series prior to joining. And I realized that I take a very different approach because I'm not rooted in STEM, I'm not rooted in environmental science. And I really wanted to think about how I could give back and share my gifts of working in education. And really, I came to the conclusion that it's talking about how I got here and not necessarily the research that I'm doing at U of A. So I don't share this as an authority, but as someone who's still learning, and I'm just committed to showing up with humility, accountability, and care. So where I'm coming from, my positionality in this work, it's in no particular order, but I put a father and a husband, so I'm really just trying to provide in a world making it harder to do so. I'm a first-generation post-secondary student, so I like to say I'm figuring it out as I go, without a roadmap, but definitely with purpose. I'm a guest of Indigenous Lands and grateful to live and work here. I've always learned, or I'm always learning what it means to show up with respect. And I make clear that I'm a non-Native American ally, so I'm not Indigenous to these lands, and I recognize that in this role. I always like to say I recognize I'm taking space, and space that really does belong to Native educators, researchers, and leaders. So within this space, doing the best I can to support as an ally, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means within the context of education. So for me, just very briefly, allyship, walking beside, not ahead. So when any environment that I'm in, whether it's a school, I work in K-12 education, or it's being in the academy, I'm not there to dictate community needs. I'm just there to support Indigenous-led priorities the best that I can, and that's really important for me. Decentering ego. So I know we often hear about, saviors in the space. So it's really not about being a hero. It's just about building space for people to share their voices, being accountable to relationships and long-term reciprocity, uplifting stories, so avoiding extracting or retelling for my own benefit, and just listening more than speaking. So I will always see myself as a learner in the space. Like, it goes without saying, but having a PhD in Indigenous Studies, I would never ever have the audacity to refer to myself as an expert in any, by any means. And it's showing up. It's not just showing support. So sometimes I feel in the space that showing support can be performative, a like, a repost. I really believe in the idea of building real relationships, and I can see firsthand very quickly at my brief time at IRES that this is central to the work that is being done. That idea that everything is founded in relationships and there is no work without these relationships. And so that's a really important piece of the work. And it's showing up when it's inconvenient, it's being accountable when you mess up, it's knowing when to speak up and when to stand back. And so I do really genuinely take being in this space as a privilege. And I think it does come with a high level of responsibility. And it's just something that I'm just very, the word would be, I'm very committed to just being in this space and doing the best that I can. And that's a big part of what it means to me. I think in addition to the last slide, I just show this because I want to make the point that I didn't grow up with a sense of community like a lot of people. So I use this is my aunts, my uncles, my first cousins. I've met them all, but I didn't grow up around them. And so that represents my dad being the only one out of all his siblings leaving Cape Town, South Africa during the apartheid era to come to Canada. And on the contrary, his mother would have been the only sibling to have stayed in South Africa during apartheid. And then my mother being an only child and being adopted. And so that's my mother and father in the far right corner. But just this idea that I grew up without first cousins, I grew up very, my camaraderie was formed through different avenues and outlets, sports. And so I just didn't grow up with that. So when I talked about working in community schools, I give this context because it's important to show that being embraced by community and working within community was something that was very much new to me. It wasn't something that was of second nature, something that I necessarily knew or understood. So I'm going to play a quick video. Some people might not know much about community schools. And I make clear that it's I'm from Canada, so First Nations community school context, meaning that I'm working in a school that is I'm working in schools that are governed by the community itself. They serve students from the communities and from the local nation. Now I shared this video first because I want to kind of, I could talk and talk, but I could never do justice, and a video still won't do justice to a lot of the, just the beautiful time I had at Seabird Island, one of the community schools I worked. And this was actually a video I was able to produce and was very fortunate to be involved in that process. And so I would just like to share prior to continuing with the presentation.
The children are our future, and we need to set a strong foundation for them.
And I see some happiness with the little ones, then I said, wow, like, they're so pure. They didn't have to go through what I did.
My mom went to residential school, and she was mean.
I can say I was probably one of more of the fortunate ones that didn't get hurt as much as some of the other students that attended day school.
I didn't feel good at the public school. It was very demeaning. I was being bullied by older students, and I felt really out of place.
We just didn't really bring very much of our Indigenous being out for protection purposes.
The elders got together and said they need to teach the language, the culture, and that's why we opened.
So this is Mary Charles. Her Willamook name is Lamo Iwasdau. She's my aunt through my dad's side of the family, and she's the one that first started getting all of our mums and everybody else involved in education. And the school is named after her.
When you walk through the doors, it's like coming home.
Really nice when kids can come up and give you a hug or a high five, or even be called auntie by some of the teachers here.
I try to get the kids to treat it like it's their house. I don't do assigned seating for the most part, just to let them be comfortable in the whole environment.
We feed about 100 students a day. It's almost every student orders, and if they don't have any money to order any food, then we just make them a peanut butter and jam sandwich.
If you need to work your mind, you need to have a full belly, I think. Even if they've had breakfast at home, they still eat.
I know most of their parents or their grandparents, and some of them try to test me on it. And I'm like, no, you don't. You don't know where I live. You don't know who my mom is. And I'm like, yeah, I do. I went to school with your mom. Or I went to school with your uncle. I'm like, okay, do I need to have grandma come in here? Do I need to have a chat with grandma?
That's perfect. So what are the two things?
When I interact with the children, I make sure to make real personal connections to them.
If you show respect, then you receive respect.
I look at them wholly as human beings and not as someone younger and unimportant. I value their knowledge, I value their connection, I value their being, and I thank them every day for deciding to come here.
I learn as much from them as I hope that they're learning from me.
I like encouraging kids that are like sloughing it.
I've had kids, say to me, Miss White, I'm not gonna make it. And I've said to them, I don't understand that sentence, so I'm just not accepting that. Here's what we're gonna do.
And I said, come on, you guys, I know you can do it. They go, no, I'm dumb. And I said, nobody in this classroom's dumb.
The mom called me, oh, he's discouraged. I said, honey, there is no world in which I'm alive and he's not graduating. And she said to me, well, Miss White, if that's what you say, then I could just plan for his grad.
The little ones, they've changed. Some of them, they used to be hard to handle, and next thing you know, they're drumming. Next thing you know, they're really part of the whole class.
I'll say, okay, let's go to the gym. They're ready to line up. They'll wait and line up for 5 minutes.
My favorite part of the day is when I hear the children all say the prayer, because it's the most language that's spoken throughout the whole day in one consecutive. When the children learn the language, it's like looking at a little spark in their eye, And when that spark gets hit with the language, it just explodes.
And a few of our kids have a homo squeak, and we try and use that as much as possible and try and get them to write it down when they can. And we searched the word for oh my goodness. So we say it, every now and then, "Ayloo," and then the kids say it. The more they hear it, the more they'll remember.
It's the most powerful thing to have your culture and language. And I hope the kids understand that, like how lucky they are.
I can just imagine our old grandmothers just saying, "Oh, honey, oh, satsa, eh." So
We have a naming ceremony in the spring.
That doesn't happen in public school, but it happens here every year. We'd finish work here at 4, then go over to the sewing room and sew.
a lot of our items are hand sewn, and there's not too many sewers left anymore. And it's hours and hours and hours of sewing.
Well, we did this because we felt it was important that they got their name, because they had to show respect, they had to keep up their education.
And it teaches the children an awful lot about who they are and how they're connected to this land and this area.
I think the most important thing that they need to understand is who they are and where they come from. Otherwise, they're going to struggle with their education.
If they were in a mainstream, they wouldn't feel more at home in their setting in the mainstream until they've learned their own culture first. It gives them that boost they need to strive, because, I've come from a good culture.
And I've seen a lot of the kids that used to go to school here, a lot of them got education and doing good in their work.
I had another experience where a student texted me and said, "Miss White, I'm in university and I'm going through so much with my family and I want to quit. But I hear your voice in my head and I can't give up." That's it.
When they first had the college, I said, look, not only can you go to elementary school, go to high school, now you can go to college here in your own community.
Those kids are going out and they're going to make families, and their families are going to be changed because of who they are and how they have changed.
I hope they'll be more successful than I am and give back to the community. That's my hope for them.
That's the wealth, for me, of what is being done in the hearts and minds of kids.
And if children believe they're important as children, they'll believe they're important as adults, and they'll feel loved. And the care and the love is genuine. I genuinely love all these children here, and it's so important.
Okay, so I'd like to transition to talking a little bit about how my work in community schools began. In the first year of my PhD program, really the coursework, we realized that I didn't have a strong enough sense of community to facilitate research. Everything we were learning in the coursework, I list people: Sean Wilson, Mary Batiste, Margaret Kovach. All of these works, they really were rooted in this idea that relationships have to be the method and the outcome of your work. And so if none of, it really just made clear the fact that none of the work I was going to do would matter if it wasn't rooted in this sense of relationship, reciprocity, and accountability. And so I felt very, very much disconnected from the communities I wanted to serve, and just thought that was really problematic with my work. I felt kind of, I don't know, putting it simply, like fraudulent, kind of being in the space and trying to facilitate a PhD without having relationships with people. And so it felt really hollow. And so, having already had a teaching background, I taught 1 year prior to, I just made the decision that I was going to push towards working in a community school, not as an act of charity or expertise, but a way of stepping into responsibility and learning how to show up differently. It's random, but like there were a lot of things. This was like I moved home briefly before I had to leave to teaching community. But even like in my household, this is just like my father and the list that he left every day on the counter of things I had to take care of in the house. Not that it's just putting it out there that there was like tension in the house sometimes, how my dad would come at me, and so I show it to like teacher candidates to really see like, you know, there's different reasons that make us pursue things, but I don't know, it's a bit random. So when I started my job, when I started working community, so there I am in Toronto, the green marker. Initially, there were 3 community schools that I had offers on the table for. One was Long Loch 58 in Ontario, one was Blueberry River First Nations, and the other being Telegraph Creek. And so I talk a little bit about how I made that decision to show up in community, or which community I chose, and the factors that went into that decision for me. And so we often talk about with students the zone of proximal development. And so that's like in the middle, we have can do now, which a lot of the time is our comfort zone. We have outside of that, the learning zone, where students can learn with support. And outside of that, it's can't do just yet and places too much pressure on students. It creates a sense of anxiety. So working within the zone of proximal development is huge to helping kids stretch and learn. But I use this as an extension to talk about your decision to work in community, if that's something that you choose to do, because where you go has to be somewhere where you feel it's a healthy stretch. Too many factors where you're just not ready as a person is going to create a sense of anxiety where you're just not in an optimal place to be teaching in community. So before saying yes to teaching in a community, things to ask yourself. Can I regulate myself in an unfamiliar or isolated setting? Am I equipped to work in a community navigating ongoing trauma without absorbing or re-traumatizing? Do I understand the difference between being challenged and being in crisis? Can I process hard things without unloading them onto the very community I'm meant to support? Am I here because I truly want to build this community, or because I'm trying to prove something to myself or others? And will my presence uplift or become another absence to grieve? And so when I go back here to kind of put this in perspective, these are very, very remote communities, and maybe the map doesn't do it justice. So I use this as an example. This was a community ultimately that I decided I wasn't built to teach in. I wasn't ready to teach in, even though I was offered a job. This is Telegraph Creek. The green pin represents the community. The closest towns nearby are 11 hours in either direction. And the roads, it's known as some of the most dangerous roads in all of North America. And I just use this as an example to show, like, you know, there were many, this was one factor I decided I couldn't teach within the school context. Another being, it was absurd to me, Long Loch, the other community, the community knew that I dropped science and math in high school, but really needed a teacher, and said that they'd be willing to bring me on board as the high school math and science teacher. And that really just painted a perspective of the need in communities, because there's, in Canada, there's super high experiences with, you know, struggling with teacher retention and turnover. I use this, this was me being in community. So when I talk about being a candidate, I still stayed a PhD student. I use this to show, like, when I got to school, I continued my PhD courses. I continued while I was teaching. I was a full-time teacher and a full-time student. Calling into my coursework in my classes, I would sit in a big empty office with a phone like this on the ground, and I would call into all of my classes and still participate, and because I was determined to finish my studies as well. And I found this picture, it just reminds me of, like, how different it was being in community, growing up in a city, my year before having taught in Bangkok, Thailand, growing up in Toronto, Ontario. This was like the first thing that I can remember that really put into perspective how far I was from home, was seeing like wild horses outside of the classroom window. I put this in here very briefly, and I'm going to explain why. This is my very first year teaching overseas in Bangkok, Thailand, working at Crescent Islamic International School, and very different experience from working in community schools. And I'm going to talk about that moving forward, why it's relevant. So at first glance, the average person who steps into these environments, they're going to see things, but they're very surface level observations. They're not value judgment. Certain things may look like low engagement, but they simply reflect different relationships in education. So at an international school, I might have from the get-go had high parent turnover at school events. Students were always early, always appeared super motivated and prepared. Their homework was always done. There was frequent verbal participation. Every time you asked a question, you'd have 10 kids with their hands up. And when I arrived in community school, it was different for me. And I'm just genuinely sharing, but I'm going to unpack this a little bit more. It wasn't so black and white getting family to turn out to events that were at the school. Students sometimes arrived later. Their engagement looked very different. I could pose questions and students may not have their hands up. Homework completion could be mixed, and participation tended to be more reserved. So I put this picture here because when we unpack this, and it's like, when we unpack this, I've heard so many kind of I use this as an example. The word is dense. I've heard a lot of dense responses from a lot of non-Indigenous people in relation to why those differences occur within the two different school settings in a lot of cases. And a lot of the time you hear really ignorant things. Well, maybe families and students and communities don't care about school. They don't, and you hear, things that really make my blood boil when, based on my experience. So one thing, being non-native and in the space, is starting to understand the deeper context for Indigenous education. I started off in an environment where formal education was associated with opportunity and mobility for families in Thailand, in Bangkok. It was something where families would kill for that opportunity for it, but it didn't represent that to the families in the community schools I taught at. It was often linked to colonization and intergenerational trauma. Cultural fit of curriculum in an international school often aligned with families' aspirations and values, where a lot of the time in community schools, despite being in the community, non-native teachers didn't integrate curriculum that reflected cultural relevance or Indigenous worldview. Of course, trust is a huge one. We can't assume that families and students are trusting of the environment, of the educational environment. It's just something that's, based on that historical context, it's something that we can't just, assume. The way that families engage, and then so yeah, it's just very different. And it's not this, it's not this idea of one being better than the other. It's people's relationship, the history, trust, and relevance they have placed in school is drastically different. So it's not about building Indigenous. I want to make clear, it's not about building resilience in Indigenous students. They already carry deep resilience. It's about creating environments that honor and support that and protect that resilience. So as a non-native ally, I would say my role is to listen, walk with, and amplify, and not so much to dictate. And this, again, that's why I kind of preface this presentation. This is not, an objective truth. This is just some of the factors that go into making us resilient as people. Supportive relationships, cultural identity, knowing who we are, where we come from, purpose and meaning, self-belief, emotional regulation, adaptability, positive outlook, problem-solving skills, spirituality and ceremony, safe environments. And for everybody, we have different ways to tap into our resilience and different places in terms of where that resilience comes from. And a lot of my students, I love seeing that they really do, my students and their families do know who they are and where they come from. Whereas for someone like myself, it might be very different. I might tap into it through self-belief more than other avenues. So just making clear that resilience is something that is very much a spectrum and a journey, not just like an endpoint. Oh, either you are or you are not a resilient person. So I use this as an example. Go back here. So safe environments being a huge one. So when you work in the context of community school, I find that one of the most important facets and foundational pieces of teaching is your ability to create safe environments. And that's a big part of that is classroom management, but understanding that classroom management, there's culturally responsive classroom management, and that looks very different than classroom management in a typical sense. And so I use this because a lot of times being blunt, like teachers are not prepared for the behaviors that they see in class. They don't know how to deal with them. They're not taught, and they're just not built for it. They're not ready. They're thrown off. And so the examples here, you could have, some of the things that I ran into in my first year in terms of behavior. Students running away or hiding. That's Nathan, or Caleb, he would put a pirate flag on his desk when he was in a bad mood and sit under the desk and wouldn't move. And I use this flipping the bird at students, students talking disrespectfully or showing a middle finger. But the point being, like, it's never your job to come into community with an authoritarian viewpoint, because when you do, you lose your students and your relationships to them so fast. And it's something that maybe as a new teacher, you might think you need to exercise your authority in classrooms to get kids to listen, but it really does not work. And so it's, as you mature and you learn in the classroom environment, you realize that it's all about decompressing, helping students decompress, about not responding with the energy that students come with, and keeping the classroom as a calm and grounded place. So I might have a student, an example I like to use is a student who comes in, he's all fired up from the second he steps into the classroom, he lashes out, he's angry, he's throwing a tantrum. And when I started teaching, it might look something like disciplinary behavior, where that transitioned over time to being like, listen, like it's honestly, it's clear you're having a rough day. I can see by how you've stepped in this class. When you're ready, I want you to re-enter the space, take as much time as you need. We love your presence and we're happy to have you back here. And that's something that, it came with time, learning that patience, learning not to escalate situations that don't need to be escalated, and really it's just like you don't need these very strong forms of discipline. What you need is a consistent structure and presence for your students, so that there's a sense of routine, so that they know you are the person you say you are, you show up the way that you're supposed to, and that you're a consistent presence in that space. And so behavior is communication. So I spent a year teaching in a program with Dr. Gabor Mate called Compassionate Inquiry. And he's very well known as being an expert in the space of trauma. But these quotes are, I guess, very consistent themes within his work that really help me relate to students, that help me understand, and just change the way that I saw education. So when we understand the past, both personal and collective, we stop asking what's wrong with this student, and we start asking what happened. And behaviors tend to make sense when you understand the past, but it's not, seeing students from this deficit-based lens that they often are seen in formal education, but not asking what's wrong with the behavior, but what function is it serving for that particular student. And I give some examples here. This is not comprehensive, but I wanted to kind of paint this picture. So, you might have a student with frequent outbursts or aggression. It's a fight response. Could be a reaction to feeling unsafe or unseen. Shut down or refusal to engage. Freeze response, overwhelmed or emotionally overloaded. A student who can't stop joking about every single thing, even when it's time to be serious. Masking pain with humor, a way to maintain control. Perfectionism, anxiety about failure. What we deem disrespectful tone or language, testing boundaries for safety. Difficulty concentrating, ongoing stress to the nervous system stuck in survival mode. Avoidance of certain topics or tasks, emotional triggers linked to past experiences. So the point being, whenever we see these behaviors in a classroom setting, we can't be quick to jump the gun and just perceive it as bad behavior. We really have to ask ourselves where this behavior comes from, how does it manifest, what are experiences that a student has had that trigger these types of behaviors, and you have to have that level of awareness and just continuously coming from a place of understanding, what I would try to convey to any new teachers. And so I think one thing I would say I learned from communities, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but I would say a common thread throughout all the schools that I worked at, that communities wanted educators not from community to understand, is that we are not just nurturing and creating academics and students. we have to look at how our teaching informs students, not just in the classroom, but in the greater school, within their families, their caregivers, and their communities. And so it's making sure that these tenets in the middle, this is called the castle framework. I used it, it's not perfect, but I used it because it's the most comprehensive thing I could find to try to convey the point. So self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making needing to be central to teaching whatever curriculum you're teaching. These need to be a central part of the learning environment. Students need to know how to relate to one another, how to take care of one another, how to regulate their emotions, how to treat people with respect. And I think a lot of the time it's modeling real world environments. One thing I would always say to my students, you know, especially with the younger ones, sometimes you might have students who come up to you and say like, so-and-so doesn't want to be my friend. And I would always relay to my students, so-and-so doesn't have to be your friend, but so-and-so has to have respect for you. And I think that's really important to teach students real life skills and these, you know, this doesn't always have to be taught as a standalone social emotional learning piece. It has to be integrated into your practice. And then there's a big gray area here because a lot of the times, you know, teachers come in and they think that they can just teach socio-emotional learning. I'm going to come into a classroom and I'm going to teach kids how to regulate. But the reality is that the way that your students learn is from the behaviors that you role model in class, the way that you regulate, the way that you problem solve, the way that you maintain an even keel and an optimistic outlook, even when you're facing challenges to student behaviors in class and working with students and how you support them through challenges. And so a lot of the time I call this the gray area because a lot of being a successful teacher is rooted just in who you are as a person. It's not something that can always be taught. I'm not saying that every teacher can't be effective, but it's how you've responded throughout your life to things like adversity, loss, community, joy. And it's not just about course or curriculum. It's through reflection, struggle, and real world humility. Resilience isn't a fixed trait that you either have or don't have. It's a spectrum and a journey, as I said earlier. And I often say that perfection is the lowest standard. This was a quote that I heard, I can't recall from where, but it's something that I believe in because when we have our students striving for perfection, it's an unrealistic standard that typically tends to lead to low self-esteem, being too hard on oneself. So that's important. Now, the myth of setting the bar. So I made a transition from working in community schools to working in public schools as an Indigenous enhancement teacher. And what that meant was that really I was just there to support students Indigenous students within a public school setting. There was many reserves around this particular school. And so there was a very huge Indigenous student body. And one thing that really broke my heart in class was seeing the number of students who fell through the cracks simply because their teachers set this one precedent that all students had to live up to. It was, this is what we're doing in class. Either you can do it or you can't. If you can't do it, you're going to figure out how to do it. And it was just like, you know, it was really baffling because I would see students in class spend days on end not getting something, struggling, just with their head down. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we work to combat that, but understanding that every student's on a distinct journey with different challenges, strengths, and timing, and real high expectations don't come from setting a bar, they come from walking with students as they grow. So what do we reflect to others about themselves? Or what is important that we reflect, that we see their potential, that we believe in their worth, and that their effort is seen and their journey is respected. So I would say one of the top principles in being an effective teacher is rooted in this concept of what do we reflect to others about themselves? Because a lot of the time you might think teachers are hard on students. If you knew just how hard these students are on themselves, it would blow your mind. How, you know, how they beat themselves up for making mistakes, how, you know, it's just like, it's ruthless. And so it's like, it's this idea that regardless of how a student is showing up, A lot of times, you know, being transparent, a lot of times it's really easy. A student's demonstrating that they can be successful in class, they're listening, they're doing what they're supposed to do, they're on task. But the toughest part of being a teacher is maintaining that vision for students who don't see it yet for themselves. And that's different for every student. And that's kind of what I'm talking about in relation to that idea of meeting students where they're at. So we guide students with structure, consistency, and clear goals. And we ask them to show up, try again, and grow. And so building on this, coming to a close pretty soon, but we often talk about differentiation as tailoring content to meet students at their academic level, but real differentiation goes deeper. It's about seeing the whole student, including their learning styles, their strengths and gifts, their cultural ways of knowing, and the ways they feel most seen and capable. So at a base level, you could take, teachers have to be very strong at benchmarking. So let's just say that example I gave where students couldn't grasp the content. You could go and you could benchmark a student to gauge exactly where they're at, and you could provide them with content at their level. And you would see that student almost immediately transform and go from a student who's disconnected, disengaged, to doing the work because it's at their level. But differentiation goes way beyond just adapting content to students' level. It also goes into tailoring their strengths and gifts. And so a lot of the time I guess in a Western context, we hear of Gardner's theory of multiple intelligence. You have kinesthetic learners, you have artistic, visual, audio learners. But putting that aside, it's just working the students' strengths and their gifts and always giving students outlets to be able to thrive and demonstrate their learning in class. So I use this example, a student that I'm working with, I can't participate with what's going on in this class. I don't know how to write a story, and our topic is to write a story. And it was a student who struggled with reading and couldn't write. And that was the task, and the teacher was not making adaptations. And so it's my role to step into the class. So very quickly, we find, yeah, you might not know how to write a story, but that doesn't mean that you can't tell a story. And, you know, we work together, we use voice to text, we work to help that student produce a story, to showing that student the visual component of how you create something that looks like a story, a cover, and having something to show their teacher and to share with their class, and just have them excited about learning. So the point being, there's always ways for, you know, there's so much there, and there's, you know, we have to really reach and cater to students' gifts, whatever they might be. Then, so this is a really controversial one. But I call this, the more you know you don't know. So working in community schools, even having my PhD in Indigenous Studies, the more I learn about Indigenous cultures and worldviews, the more it reaffirms for me that culture isn't something you teach when it isn't your own. And a lot of people might take that as, you know, that's just you not making an effort. And that's not the case, and that's not the point that I'm trying to convey. When it comes to teaching, the depth requires this experience, not just care or good intentions. You can teach with commitment and relevance, but you can't replicate what's rooted in generations of place, language, and relationship. So my role isn't to translate culture, it's to respect it, make space for it, and build a curriculum that invites it in through community voice. So cultural knowledge isn't delivered, it's carried, and it's shared by those who live it. And so as a teacher, it's very tough coming into a school trying to bring culture into the curriculum, because you're creating a platform for community voices to reach students, but at the same time, you can't really do that without relationships. And so right off the bat, you're not, you know, it's not that black and white. You can't just bring culture be a new teacher stepping foot in community and bring culture into the classroom. It doesn't work like that. It comes from, you know, getting to know people, forming those relationships, spending time with people, accepting invitations outside of community, being present in your students' life, seeing how you interact with communities. And so for me, it's something where it's like, I really don't feel in a lot of cases, I would never be someone as a non-Indigenous person to bring cultural teachings myself into a classroom. And it's all about not knowing everything, but knowing what's yours to teach and what's not. So critical thinking skills you can teach, tools for navigating school and beyond, historical truths, including colonization, residential schools, systemic injustice, when taught responsibly with community accountability, respectful collaboration, and just making space for other people. So it's just knowing your role in many cases. And so I veered away from talking about like statistics about teacher retention rates, attendance statistics, standardized test scores, parent involvement metrics, behavior incident reports, graduation rates. I really stayed away from talking about all of these things because it's something that academia consistently tries to measure when operationalizing this deficit gap for Indigenous students, but it doesn't capture the whole picture. It really doesn't capture anything in a lot of cases. So when we talk about teacher retention rates, yeah, but are you able to capture through your data the heartbreak your students are carrying? Have you seen the look on your students' faces after you've been an integral part of their life, and then you step out of the community and say, they ask, are you back next year? And you say, no. It's very difficult. Students might miss school to support family and attend ceremony or fulfill community roles. The quiet disengagement when teachings ignore who students are and where they come from. The aunties, cousins, elders, and community show up in ways that surveys will never capture. The untold stories of loss, trauma, and survival behind each outburst or shutdown. The resilience it takes to keep going when your world isn't reflected in the system. And so to conclude, if we want students to show up as their full selves, we need to create spaces where they don't feel the need to shrink, translate, or perform just to belong. It's not about shaping students into something, it's about recognizing and honoring who they already are. Our job is to protect that identity, nourish it, and create the conditions where they can grow with confidence and care. And I put this here, so very recently, you know, I had a family member that I was close with pass, and this was late last week, and someone who was just like, in many ways, my idol, still in Cape Town. And I was thinking back, and I was thinking to myself, what was the last thing that that person told me? And interesting, because I was thinking and thinking and thinking, and it was when I literally arrived in Tucson a few months ago and was talking to them about some of the challenges I'm facing, the transition, starting over again, being away from my family, starting a new family. And the very last words I can remember my uncle saying are, at the end of the day, he just said, you know what, at the end of the day, you're going to sprout wherever you're planted. And it's so, for me, that really stuck with me because that's something that I would love to relay and have students encompass that level of self-belief, that they know whatever environment they're put in, no matter what they deal with, that we're still going to provide opportunities for students to succeed. And so that's something that really just means something to me, but that's my presentation.
We have a Q&A, so if people in the room people in the room have a question, for anyone online, feel free to just unmute yourself or raise your hand. What inspired you to help Indigenous people?
Great question. It started off, I would say, in post-secondary largely, and it was about people who embraced, were responsive to my needs, and just treated me as a human before a student in university. So I was having a really hard time in post-secondary myself, fitting in, finding my place, and just didn't feel like it was an environment for me. You know, everywhere I went, I felt like people just genuinely didn't give a shit, and they just, you know, they wouldn't reason with me. And so when I stepped into some of my teachers in the Indigenous Studies department, they just like, I could just feel like very genuinely that there were people who were just wanted to make sure that I was successful in my learning journey. And so that's a huge part of how that transpired.
A few of us came in late, so I wonder, would you mind telling a little bit about your postdoc here at IRES at the University of Arizona and your plans, what you're doing? Thank you.
So I stepped in fairly recently in December. Right now, the bulk of my work, a large part of it will be working with the Navajo Star School in Flagstaff and doing a longitudinal study looking at the lives of alumni in the school. You know, it's a very different project for me, and it's something where school being so far away, I'm really looking to get more and more involved. But it's different because my background is in community education, and so it's different for me working with schools from the outside in. So I want to continuously try to find ways to build relationships with teachers and students, but it's not black and white because, you know, my experience just tells me it takes a very long time to build trust and community, and from students and from families and from everyone. And so it's I want to try to find my way to get more immersed in the school, but really it's looking at how being in a community school impacted student alumni who are over 18 years of age. How did it affect their self-esteem? How did it affect their cultural beliefs, community building, their sense of family? Because all these things my experience teaches me community schools can provide for students, but it's so I'm trying to capture that within the longitudinal study at Star School. So that's a big part of it.
Okay, thank you, and thanks for sharing your story.
Not a question, just a comment, but I appreciate that the slide that you shared about bringing in culture and language, and that even that if you're not from that community, it has to be that lived experience that makes it, you know, more powerful and genuine. So just kind of knowing your place, I think that's really important. But when I was looking at that slide, I was thinking about our teachers who are in ITEP. They're from tribal communities, but some of them are teaching and like doing their student teaching, their practicum in other schools that is not their own home tribal community. So those still resonate when you're working. Say I'm Dene, so if I worked at a school on Tohono Nation, I would still kind of use that, you know, that criteria when going to work in their community. And so like, I think that a lot of people just don't realize that you still need to do that even if you're not from that's not your home community. You may be tribal, you may be Indigenous or a Native teacher, an educator, but that's not your home community. So you still have to have that respect and understanding going in, you know, that you're not the expert, you know, right? So it's just really important to, I think, relay that message to everybody, and how important that is. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you. And I thought about something similar to what you're saying on my walk here, and I didn't bring it up during my presentation, but talking with Renee, the other postdoc, that exact idea that when you're not working, despite being from community, when you're working in a community that's not your own, you're still classified as an ally. It doesn't mean that because you come from a different community that you're in that same boat as people, you know, being a community member. But yeah, a lot of my work, I really like that point. And I would just say a lot of my work when I speak sometimes, it's like without even realizing it, or consciously catering, or I'm talking to the non-Indigenous ally because I've seen how problematic those relationships can be in community schools, where people come in and they think they know what communities need, whereas the majority of the time, I think a lot of Indigenous teacher candidates inherently understand that they know their place within community more. So that's maybe why sometimes it comes off that way.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to add on to what she was saying and how you mentioned, or I like that how you mentioned that knowing what's yours to teach versus what is not. So a lot of what you're saying is narrowed down to that concept.
I guess I was just curious, or if you'd be willing to kind of share some of your thoughts or like words of wisdom, because I think in my experience, when you're working with non-native instructors, professors, researchers, I think that, and I really appreciated your slide, how you shared like um, teaching tools don't necessarily come from course or curriculum, but it's earned through reflection, struggle, and real world humility. So I guess from your perspective, like what are some of those words to kind of share, like how to like a non-native ally, like how to make that connection? Because I guess like I've heard from folks like I have nothing to share, like I can't relate to students or this is beyond me, like trying to connect with native um students or like a native community. Like I guess how would you really kind of share that or kind of words of wisdom to really reflect on that?
The most simple words that just jump out at me are who you are is way more important than what you know. And that's something where when you step into community, you might think, I have all these qualifications, I know this, I know how to teach curriculum, I know how to plan a year, I know what curriculum structure looks like. But at the end of the day, when formal education can potentially represent something so negative, families and communities really just want to hear that their students love the classroom environment, that it's a positive place, it's a place where students feel safe, it's a place where students feel engaged in learning. And sometimes I didn't mean to paint the picture that, being in a community school is more of a challenge. Being in a community school teaches you how to become a good educator, because when students are not engaged and the way you teach is not engaging and what you teach is not engaging, students will disconnect. And so it teaches you a lot of things of being an effective educator, for being someone who has to adapt your teaching to reflect the needs and wants of your students. And a big thing I found was time. I used to genuinely, my students, I might not like a lot of their hobbies and interests, but I took a real genuine approach in how I was going to integrate that into the learning. You could talk about anything. A student might like Roblox, another student might like Minecraft, another student might like World War II, tiki huts, random stuff like that students are into at that age. But I genuinely make a concerted effort to hear my students out, hear what they love, what matters to them, and reflect that in the curriculum. And so it's just like, if I could relay anything, it's, focus first and foremost about understanding your place, being a good person, and understand what reciprocity is too, because your role in terms of giving back isn't just like, what would I say? Your role in giving back isn't just about, I'm teaching, so I'm holding up my end of the bargain. It doesn't work like that. A lot of the community is providing your sustenance, your paycheck. And so I think it's really important to show that you want to give back outside of school hours. And that's something I didn't talk about, but I was dedicated to doing every week through community fitness. So there's so much there, but at the root of it, it's like, focus on, it's more important in terms of who you are than what you know. And it's not saying don't continuously try to learn and grow, but really just, having integrity.
We have one time for one more question if you wanna, I saw your hand just raised, Dr. Chief.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce, for this excellent talk and for really sharing some of the core values that you learned in your work to date. My question is about the community school and learning more about how in Canada, the community schools, like how, what is the trajectory for integrating language in the school and culture in the school? It wasn't clear to me from the video if that school was set up to do that, or if the teachers came together collectively to make that initiative to incorporate their language and their culture? Thank you.
Yeah, I would say it's very different on a school to school basis. Based on the level of fluency, based on the resources available, and I'll give you a couple examples. Very first school I taught at, no student speakers, very few adult speakers in the community, and no mandate to bring language into the curriculum. That was Blueberry River at the time. Seabird Island, the video that I played, there is a very strong push to bring in language. They collaborate with the University of the Fraser Valley to create a Ho'okame'o language program, and all teachers were mandated to be part of that language course every week after school, once a week for a few hours, for how to bring that into a school setting. But at the same time, within that community, there were 0 fluent speakers, despite there being the strongest push for language. But then I can talk about my time at Bigstone Cree Nation, where there wasn't a mandate. No, there was a mandate to bring language into the classroom. It was a little bit different during the COVID year because they wanted to keep the elders safe, and so bringing them into the classroom was problematic. But all the adults in that entire community tended to speak Cree, and so it really depends on the community's decision, their priorities, the level of fluency. And it was, when I talk about Seabird, every teacher, every morning, it might be on a little bit of a separate note, but it was like the most beautiful grounding every day. We'd go into the gym, all students. There would be a drum circle in the middle, and it was actually led by my friend who's the cultural support worker there. And all teachers and students would say prayer in the language. Would all learn, we would all say that prayer in the language, we would all give thanks at the end. And that was how we started each day in the morning. For me, that was just like, honestly, the best way ever to start the day. But I'm sorry, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Thank you all. All right, just one more round of applause for Dr. Jason for sharing with us today. We appreciate all your time, your knowledge, and all the work that we're doing together. Thank you to our sponsors. Now I can't remember.
ITEP was one of them.
ITEP, the Water Resources Research Center, Office of Societal Impact, someone I'm forgetting, Sloan Scholars, and the Indigenous Resilience Center. We are going to have a student mentoring session. We're going to take a little bit of a break. So that'll start, what time is it? That'll start at 1:10. So if you're online or if you're in person and you're interested in staying for that, please do. And I say this, Dr. Renee and Jenny's will be same time, same place 2 weeks from today. Also on Zoom. I say this with all the love in my heart. If you're not a student, if you could grab some food and so I don't have to come up to you in 5 minutes like if we have any students stay online and we're all talking after, it'll mess with the audio. But please grab food. Pretty please, I'm begging. But yes, so if you're a student,
Just gotta walk back to your car, right?
So they're doing a worldwide Zoom outage, by the way. So people were like struggling to get out.
Excuse me.
Yeah, I know.
Look at that.